Hello, I'm Eric Bryant, and I am excited to spend some time with Drew. Drew Dyck is managing editor at Leadership Journal. He's an author. Welcome, Drew. So glad to hang out with you a little bit here.
Hey, great to be hanging out with you. Looking forward to this.
Absolutely. Well, a lot of folks that come to my website and take a look at my newsletter that'll be watching this probably are familiar with Leadership Journal and some of what you do there. That's a part of Christianity Today. But maybe share a little bit more about your journey and what you do, and I would love for some folks that don't know you to hear a little bit more about some of your efforts.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I work on Leadership Journal, which is one of the publications of Christianity Today. We're the publication that's specifically for pastors, and so that's a passion of mine, just to equip pastors and kind of be a cheerleader for the people that are in the front lines and the trenches of ministry. And so we publish a lot of stories that highlight people that are doing that, something innovative, or folks that have had a hard story and they're willing to share that, and it has something redemptive. So that's kind of what we do with Leadership Journal.
That's fantastic. Well, you're also an author, and had shared with you previously how your newest book, which I was excited when I got my copy in the mail, Yawning at Tigers, and I want you to share a little bit about that metaphor and even what the book's about. But it was a really interesting experience because the night before my wife had a dream about tigers, and so when I saw this in the mail and told her, it was kind of one of those goosebump moments. So she's actually got it now. She's reading it before I've had a chance. But tell us a little bit about what this book is about and even how you came up with that metaphor.
Well, first of all, I just want to confess that I asked God to give your wife a dream about tigers. More receptive to reading the book.
It worked.
No, it worked. I can't take credit for that. That's kind of cool, though. Well, yeah, I'll tell you. First of all, it is a strange title, Yawning at Tigers. So I'll explain that a little bit. A few years back, and a lot of people probably remember this, there was this story out of Zanesville, Ohio. This dude who had a private zoo, for reasons that are still not clear, decided to release all his wild animals. So there were lions and bears and tigers, and a lot of them kind of walked over to this small town called Zanesville. And of course, it was a total, public emergency. People panicked. They got in their houses, called the police, locked the doors, and it ignited this whole debate about animal laws in this country. And as I watched the coverage, though, it kind of took my mind in a different direction. I started to think, these people had wild, dangerous animals in their midst, and they reacted appropriately, and that is they stayed inside and got really scared. And I thought, as Christians, we claim to be engaging God, who of course is more dangerous, more exotic than any sort of animal. And sometimes we kind of show up to church and we're lackadaisical, complacent in the way we talk about God or worship Him. And I think, man, do we realize that we have this holy, sovereign God in our midst? And I think sometimes we're numb to it. So that was kind of the original motivation to write the book.
Well, I like it, and there was some really, I thought, incredibly, no other word but complimentary quote. Philip Yancey said, "A needed corrective to self-indulgent Christianity." Lee Strobel said, "A stirring challenge." Matthew Lee Anderson said about the book, "A strong antidote against a domesticated God." "You can't tame God, so stop trying" is the subtitle. Maybe share a little bit about what you learned in writing this book, and even some of what maybe a lot of Christians or people who are curious about faith misunderstand about God.
Yeah, it was, well, first of all, I think like any book that someone writes, you're writing to yourself first. And so I was exploring this topic, and it was exciting because it was just kind of an opportunity to delve into the scriptures and some ancient writing and really explore the attributes of God that I feel that I and other Christians often neglect. And my concern is that sometimes we love talking about God's love, right? Our worship songs, most of them could be sung to God or to a girl. Most sermons you hear, drip with assurances of God's affection, and that's all good. I'm not saying any of that's wrong. But I worry that as evangelicals in particular, often we sideline God's holiness, His otherness, those attributes that don't make sense to us or make us uncomfortable. There's this strong urge to edit God. Even in my life, I feel this, and attributes of His that maybe clash with my modern sensibilities. And so that's really what I wanted to do, is just to dive into it. And that's the first half of the book. I talk about God's dangerous qualities, his otherness. I talk about passages like that poor dude who put out his hand to steady the Ark of the Covenant and got struck dead by God. And Isaiah 6, where Isaiah has this incredible vision of God high and lifted up, and the angels surrounding God are hiding their face and their feet from the glory of God, and what all that means. And then in the second half, I dive into God's love, his nearness, his immanence, to use a theological word. And so it's the kind of the paradox of that I'm interested in maintaining, because I think there's a tendency, at least in my life, to collapse one side of that paradox, right? You see God as just, holy and high and lifted up, but you might lose sight of his love, or you might focus solely on his love and lose sight of his otherness. And I think Christianity, of course, maintains that God is paradoxical in that sense. He's transcendent, he's immanent, he's holy, he's loving. And so we need to maintain that paradox, I think, if we're really going to appreciate God and have a rich experience worshiping him.
I think that's completely an important message. And I do find that there's some folks that seem to take loving God seriously but forget to love people. And then there's others that love people but forget to love God. And this sovereign God who loves us, who needs to be, not needs to be, we need to worship him more than he needs to be worshipped. But this idea of fearing God, sometimes we don't understand fully in our culture. And I can't help but think of that image when I saw Yawning at Tigers, and even looking at what you're writing about there in the book.
Well, good. Yeah, that's exactly what it's meant to convey. One way I like to talk about this, you think of the disciple John, right? And there's nothing wrong with applying intimate language to our relationship with God or Jesus. You think of John, he called himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. He's depicted as laying his head on Jesus' chest. And yet that same disciple, when he sees the post-resurrected Christ on the island of Patmos, he falls at his feet, it says, as though dead. And so I think we do that first half of the equation well. We're good at snuggling up to Jesus, but often we fail to have that kind of sobriety and fear even of Jesus and God that we see in Scripture.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And again, the book is something I want to encourage people to pick up, but I also want to make sure they know where to find you online. So I'll pop this up here, drewdyck.com, that's D-Y-C-K. Maybe tell us a little bit about other things that they can find on your website, other things you write about, other insights even that you've had as you continue doing what you do.
Yeah, sure. Well, my website hasn't been up for too long. It's not all that spectacular, but it is a good place to find more about this book. I also have some fun things like a little quiz that you can answer. I think it's a dozen questions, and then according to your answers, it'll give your view of God. And there are 3 categories. There's like cosmic buddy, loving Lord, angry judge. And so it's just kind of a good conversation starter or a tool to help you think critically about how you view God. There are also some excerpts from the book, that kind of thing, and then of course ways that you can contact me. When people read, I don't like it when people will read a book that I wrote and then never contact me and reach out to me. It's like, come on, I want to start a relationship and chat about it, and if not in person, then at least online. So
absolutely,
I always appreciate that.
Well, I appreciate what you write and how you write. Just so accessible and so important.
Thanks.
Maybe share with us a little bit about your previous book, Generation X Christian. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that was a book I wrote a couple of years ago, and yeah, Generation X Christian. It's EX Christian, and so the topic is quite depressing. Basically, I was looking at those young people that had grown up in the church, and for various reasons had decided to walk away not only from the church but also their faith as well. And so I hunted down scores of 20-somethings that no longer identified as Christians and had these in-depth conversations with them. And I think a lot of people are aware of this kind of exodus from the church and even the faith among the millennials, those folks born between 1980 and 2000. I'm not a statistician or a sociologist, so I wasn't going to try to do new research, but what I could do, I thought, is as a journalist, is track down some of the faces behind the numbers, if you will, and talk to them about why they left. And then, of course, the purpose was to be able to supply Christians who cared about these people, often their parents or youth pastors or just friends, with some tips on how to engage them in conversations that might, at least nudge them back toward God.
I love it. I think, again, that's such an important thing. I can't remember. I think it was Jim Collins that talked about the oh goodness, the Stockdale paradox. That's it.
Yeah.
About being really honest about where you're at, and I think that's what you're doing for the church, helping us remember we're one generation from losing influence, and every one of us has to choose, no matter what our parents believe before us, and then our kids have to do the same thing. So not only writing about the current condition, being honest about where we're at, but giving some hope, I think is really, really good, because there are churches like the one I'm here at in Austin, Gateway, or at Mosaic in Los Angeles before that, and others that are really figuring out the way to reach a generation that is drifting away, and maybe were never there. Their parents or grandparents before them had walked away from faith.
Yeah. No, and I'm so encouraged when I hear about churches like yours and others that are succeeding in engaging millennials. And some of the pastors I talk to that are doing that, they think, well, isn't every church in the country, having 20-somethings flock to their church? Unfortunately not. It is a problem, and I think, there's a great quote, I think it was from Max Dupree, said the first task of a leader is to define reality. And so I think there is that kind of, hey, let's face up to what's happening here. 80% of 20-somethings are disengaging from the church in their 20s. And there are some people that said, oh, in past generations this happened, and they'll come back, kind of like the boomers did. Well, I'm not so sure, because there are some things about this generation that are very different. We know that things like having kids, establishing a career, buying a home, tend to encourage people to go back to church. Well, for this generation, my dad, by the time he was 22, he had like 2 kids, a house, and a career. All that stuff didn't happen for me until I was like 30. And so adulthood's being delayed, and so those primary sociological drivers that push people back towards religious involvement are disappearing. And so what we're seeing already in some of these studies is that they're not coming back. And so we don't want to be complacent about this trend. At the same time, like you said, we need a little bit of hope and some redemption. And the good news is, I think that often we imagine that maybe the young people that have disengaged from church are just all angry atheists and there's no way they're going to come back. That's not the case at all. Usually they left because they had some sort of break that happened in the context of a relationship. And so if they're going to come back, it's going to be in the context of a relationship as well. And there are things that we can do to reach out to them.
That's perfect. Well, again, grateful for you, Drew, and I want to encourage all of you to go to drewdyck.com, D-Y-C-K, check out Yawning at Tigers, and I want to thank you and your publisher for generously giving away 5 copies to those who receive my email newsletter. You can sign up for that at ericbryant.org. But thank you so much, Drew. Really appreciate it, and great to talk to you.
Hey, great to talk to you. Thanks for having me on.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
You too.